Chapter 3 I had a taste of Broadway, but after the gig at the Metropole was over I was back at the King's Lounge in North Williamsburg, playing for the boys with the pinky rings. One night a guy came up to me during a break. "I want my nephew to sit in and play," he said. I was a cocky kid then. I had a Beatles haircut and I was wearing a black vest with a polka dot tie and a white shirt and tight pants and Beatles boots. "Nobody sits in on my drums," I dismissed the guy. He threw a $50 bill on my bass drum. "The kid is going to sit in," he said firmly. And then he gave me a look that could kill. "No problem," I said meekly, and pocketed the bill. It was harrowing playing at a mob joint. I almost expected to see a bomb come in through the window. Every time the door opened and someone walked in, I was scared it might be a guy who was going to take a machine gun out from under his jacket and just level the joint. But one night in the summer of 1966, someone special walked through those doors. She was a tiny little thing with long, silky, beautiful black hair and a really cute face. I'd like to jump on that, I immediately thought. So I was all over her. We talked between each break and she told me her name was Lydia Di Leonardo, a nice Italian girl. The next day was the 4th of July, so I invited her to go to Coney Island with me. We got to the beach and I tried to be very cool. I lit a cigarette, the ash blew back in my eye, and I felt like an idiot. But once I got her on the sand, I was all over it. We were making out like crazy. I don't think it was love at first sight, but we kept seeing each other. She would come down on the weekends and see me play. We'd go to movies and hang out. Eventually I asked her to go steady. Why not? She was really smart, going to school for bookkeeping. Back in Brooklyn, if you were going to bring a girl home to mom and dad, you wanted an Italian or an Irish or even a good Jewish girl. And Lydia to me was the belladonna, the Mother Mary. A real beauty. My parents loved her. Her parents were another story. They were real Italians from Sicily. They had 3 sons and Lydia. She took me home for a Sunday dinner one night to meet them and it was right out of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? The whole family was around a table, which had an abundance of food on it. Her dad was sitting at the head of the table with a gallon of homemade wine in front of him. Her mom and dad and her brothers kept looking me up and down. And they were seeing a skinny kid with hair down to his breast and they weren't liking the picture one bit. I may as well have been black or gay. I was the enemy. They despised everything that my long hair stood for. What's worse, I wanted to be a musician, not a dentist, not a car mechanic, not even a plumber. I was a bum in their eyes. But we didn't care. After we started going steady, we had sex for the first time in Jerry Nolan's mom's bedroom. Then sometimes Lydia would cut school and come to my grandmother's house and we'd make love in the daytime. We had to keep things undercover back then, because if her family had found out they would have killed both of us. And if Lydia had found out about Linda, she might have killed me. While I was dating Lydia, I was sneaking off to have fun with a foxy little blonde whose mother owned a funeral parlor. Linda was just 16, 2 years younger than Lydia, and I was crazy about her. I would take Lydia home, then sneak off to the funeral parlor where Linda and I would make out in the coffins, bizarre but true. When I wasn't sneaking off to see Linda, I'd sneak off to see Jerry Nolan. Lydia's parents lived just blocks from Jerry in Queens. After a date, I used to tell Lydia I was going home and then I'd go over to Jerry's house. We both wanted to be famous and we knew that image was everything, so we'd sit in front of a tanning lamp, then give ourselves facials with the creams and lotions that Jerry had. Jerry had gone to barber school and he'd razor cut my hair. We looked like 2 gigolos. When I met Lydia, I was still playing with the Barracudas. but that was getting old pretty quick. We were still playing instrumentals like Tequila and Wipeout, along with some Motown and some Beatles and Stones. I was pushing to play Procol Harum or Hendrix. But Carlos was older. 24 or so, and he just didn't have that feel. He liked Motown, but he wasn't that crazy about the British invasion bands. Around that time I went to see my friend Joey Luchanti's band, and he had a guy named Pepe Generali who played a mean farfisa organ. Pepe was a great, looking blonde, blue-eyed Italian chick magnet. He wasn't happy in his band either, so he joined the Barracudas and the two of us dominated the group. Eventually Carlos left and we got Joey Luchanti in on guitar and my friend Angelo Opper on bass and a guy named Tommy Ventimiglia on sax. We started doing Brit music along with Motown, and we called ourselves the Sounds of Soul. We played all over the city. Trudy Heller's, the Night Owl, Café Wa, the Purple Onion. We worked constantly, playing a month at each club. After a while, we all wore matching double-breasted suits and ties, and we looked sharp. We even got gigs out of town. Back in 1967, it was amazing how much hatred and disdain you could generate just by wearing your hair long and dressing like Jimi Hendrix. But I didn't care. I wanted to look like a star all the time. Jerry called it profiling. We'd sit in his apartment figuring out what to wear so that people would stare at us. We were total nonconformists, total rebels. In a way, we had just graduated to a different gang. I'd leave my apartment wearing a purple satin shirt, gold pants, and a velvet jacket and walk to the subway. All along the way, the Puerto Ricans would whistle at me and call me puta, which means whore, or paco, which meant gay. They'd make kissing sounds and go, Paco, Paco, suck my dick, baby. But I didn't care. I was cool, as far as I was concerned. Coming home it was a different story. My parents had moved to Greenpoint and they lived over a bar. I was back living with them and I had a cool room. I painted the ceiling black and put stars on it so it looked like a galaxy. My mom and dad even grew pot for me on their roof, that's how cool they were. Of course, when I finally told them that that leafy green plant they were having so much fun cultivating was pot, they freaked out. My dad would meet me at the subway at 4 in the morning when I was coming back from my gigs in the village and help me with my drums. We had to push the drums 15 blocks, and the Polish drunks who were coming out of the bars would ridicule me. If I didn't have a gig, if I had just been clubbing in the village, they would chase me all the way home, and if they caught up to me, they'd push me around and pull my hair, pull out a switchblade and threaten to cut it off. I used to think, you motherfucker, 5 years earlier I would have fucking broken your knees with a bat. But now I wanted to be a rock star, so I had to endure it. I even got that shit on the road. One time the Sounds of Soul were playing in upstate New York. And we got hungry. We pulled into a truck stop, and they sent me in to get some food. I sat down, ordered some hamburgers to go, and these two huge truckers sat down on either side of me. One of them leaned over to the other and said, I bet you I could punch him so hard that my fist could come through his brains. Then the other guy described what torture he'd do to me. They started calling me Goldilocks, and I freaked out and ran out the door. And they ran after me. Tommy was driving and he saw me running toward the van with these two huge truckers hot on my heels, so he started to take off. Meanwhile, Pepe opened the back door of the van and just as I caught up, he grabbed me and pulled me in. We turned around and gave those two assholes the finger. The Sounds of Soul came to an end when our sax player, Tommy, got drafted and went to Vietnam. We were devastated, but we carried on. We wanted to play more originals, so we changed our name to the Brotherhood and began to slip some originals into our set. That didn't go over too well with the uptown clubs. What the fuck was that shit? The owner would storm over to us after the show. I told you guys I wanted to hear Green Tambourine. And then we'd get fired. 1968 was a great time to be a musician. You could see the greatest bands in the world play in the East Village at Bill Graham's Fillmore East and at the Anderson Theater down the block. I'll never forget sitting up in the balcony of the Fillmore and seeing the Jefferson Airplane. I saw the Who premier Tommy there. I saw Hendrix, The Doors, Savoy Brown, Arthur Brown, Van Morrison. My brain cells would just blow up hearing all that great stuff. But the best was Steve Paul's nightclub, The Scene. All us young musicians would hang out there in the peanut gallery and wait for all the stars to come in and jam. One night I went there with Jerry and I saw Hendrix jam with Buddy Miles and Johnny Winter. My fucking balls hit the floor. One night Janis Joplin walked in with Jim Morrison after they had played a double bill at the Fillmore, and Janis pulled a bottle of Southern Comfort out of her bag and kept topping off the glass of bourbon she ordered. Another time, Steve Paul had managed to get his hands on an advance copy of the Beatles' White Album. When I first saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, I was not that crazy about them. I loved the Stones then. But then I really got into the Beatles and their lyrics, and they changed my life. I started to wear a SGT pepper hairstyle, I grew a mustache like Paul McCartney's, and then I got into the Lennon image, all in white with white sneakers and my hair long and straight down with the wire, rimmed glasses. Waiting for a new Beatles album was like waiting for a gift from the gods. They locked the door at midnight and Steve Paul came out and said, "Shut the fuck up, everybody." You could hear a pin drop in the whole nightclub. And he played that album from side 1 to side 4 straight through, and it was like God was speaking through those speakers. We took those songs to be law. We would make our own music too, informally. Every Sunday we'd meet up at the fountain in Central Park and there'd be people jamming with guitars and bongos, people talking about music and politics, passing around joints. All of this propelled us toward wanting to do more originals. By then, Peppy and I had connected with a guitar player named Kevin Reese and a bass player named Peter Shandes, and we started a band called Nautilus. Peppy and I were the best musicians in the band, we kept the foundation solid. I wasn't the front man, but I sang most of our songs. Kevin was half black and half white with green eyes. He was gorgeous. He couldn't play that great, but he reminded me of a young Hendrix, and he had great stage presence. In those days, it seemed that how you looked was almost as important as how you played. And he looked great. And so did Peter Shandes. He lived in the Village, and that was impressive in itself. He was a true hippie nonviolent love child, with one of those birds type haircuts with the bangs. Great image, not so great a bass player. So we played the same club circuit, only with a heavier British invasion, bass sound. We gigged all around the East Coast, but one of our mainstays was a club on 42nd Street and 3rd Avenue called The Headliner. One afternoon in the fall of 1969 we were rehearsing there, and this guy walked in accompanied by a knockout babe. He was in his 30s, blonde, with thinning hair but really built, easily a 200-pound guy. He had a bulldogish look about him, like he was a guy you didn't want to cross. His girlfriend was a little bit younger, a flaming redhead with a gorgeous face and a knockout body. He introduced her as Kathy and said his name was Jack O'Brien, which was odd because he looked about as Irish as I was. But what immediately captivated us was that he said he was a close friend of Bob Seger, whose group, the Bob Seger System, had just had its first hit. He had helped produce the album and he was tight with all the music people in the Detroit scene, he told us. He and his girlfriend were living in New York now and he wanted to get involved with a group, maybe manage them like Brian Epstein had done with the Beatles, or maybe even sing with them since he was also a singer. He said he had heard us play and he liked what he heard. So after buying us a round of drinks, he invited the band up to his penthouse apartment to continue the discussion. I took one look at his huge diamond ring, his gold Rolex and gold jewelry, and Kathy's even bigger rock, and I knew he was the real deal. This was the jump connection we so desperately needed. We followed him past his doorman and up to his pad. Looking out the big picture windows, we saw a spectacular view of the cityscape. And we were lapping up everything he was saying. "I'm gonna get you guys a deal, you're great," he enthused. "First of all, we gotta get you a decent PA system. Then we'll go out to our place on Long Island and you guys can hole up there and write and rehearse. I'll be coming out periodically and I'll sit in with you. We'll put a show together and get a deal. And don't worry, I'll pay for everything." A few days later, Jack called and told us to get a U-Haul van. We met him and he told us to drive to some parking lot where he made us take the license plates off 2 cars and put one of them on our van. As tough as I was, I had never done anything like that in my life. It should have been a tip off to us that Jack wasn't who he appeared to be. Then he had us pull the van in front of Manny's music store on 48th Street, where Kathy was sitting in a limo waiting for us. Both Jack and Kathy were wearing wigs that day and it struck us as a little strange, but we didn't think much of it. And we certainly didn't give it a second thought when 2 guys who worked at Manny's schlepped out this great Altec Lansing PA system and helped us put it into the van. Then Jack gave us some pills that were like speed and downers at the same time. After we got the PA to Pepe's dad's warehouse, I felt so weird I thought I was going to die. I crashed big time, but I still had this lingering feeling that something was really weird. We took all our equipment, including Pepe's B3 Hammond organ, my set of drums, 2 big amps, some big fenders, and the PA system, and drove out to Jack's house on Long Island. It wasn't a mansion by any stretch of the imagination, but the house was nice enough and he had a big basement where we set up our stuff. We started working on songs and Jack would come out every weekend, drop off some money for us, and listen to the stuff. "What ya got?" he'd say, and we'd play him the songs. "That's pretty good," he smiled. We kept asking him to sit in and sing, but he kept putting us off. "I don't feel like it this weekend, my throat is bugging me today." "Next time," he'd say. "But keep practicing. I like what I'm hearing." Then he peeled some cash off his roll and dropped it on the table. This went on for months and months. I was seeing Lydia then, and she'd come out occasionally to visit, but we were consumed with our music. This was our big break and we certainly weren't going to fuck it up. After about 5 months of this, some doubts about what we were doing began to creep in. Every time we'd ask Jack to sing with us, he had some excuse. And we were getting cabin fever. We all wanted to get out and gig and try out the material we had been writing and rehearsing. Plus we started questioning just who this guy Jack really was. Every time he and Kathy would come out to the house, they were driving a different luxury car. And they'd retreat into their room, which had a huge padlock on the door. Plus it didn't take a brain surgeon to realize that both of them were cranked up on meth most of the time. We wanted to confront Jack, tell him that we wanted out of there, but we were afraid to bring the topic up. One day, just before Jack and Kathy were due out, we all smoked some weed and Pepe decided that he was going to talk to Jack. That night, we were all sitting around the dinner table. Me and Pepe and Kevin and Peter were stoned on pot, giggling, but Jack and Kathy were tweaked out on speed. "Look, Jack," Pepe suddenly said. "We're getting tired of this shit. We came here to make it, but all we're doing is rehearsing in the basement. We want to get out of here and play. The table immediately grew silent. Peppy went on a bit more about how we were just going to leave. Jack just sat there and stared at Peppy. Really, he finally said. And then he picked up his glass and threw it at Peppy, hitting him square in the forehead. The glass shattered and Peppy began to bleed profusely. Anybody else got something to say to me? Jack stared at Kevin and Peter and me. We were in total shock. I'll never forget his piercing, weird eyes. Hey, man, that wasn't cool, I managed to protest. Shut the fuck up, he snapped at me. You ain't fucking going nowhere. That's the way it's gonna be. My way or no way. The four of us freaked out. Jack and Kathy retreated into their locked room, and when they came out, Kathy was wearing a wig and an outfit that made her look like a 50-year-old woman, and Jack had a mustache that made him look completely different. You guys just stay here and play, he said, and then they left. I called Lydia and said, we're going to get out of here. My buddy told me about a gig up in Kennebunkport, Maine. We could be the house band for this fraternity, and they'll pay us a salary. We'll live in the back of the bar, they'll feed us. We've just got to get out of here. This guy Jack is dangerous. We snuck out, rented a truck, loaded it up, and took off and drove up to Maine. We were thinking, wow, we're free, we got away from this fucking guy, thank you Jesus. That's the last we'll ever see of Jack. About halfway through the summer, we were playing one night and I looked out at the audience, and sitting there at a table was Jack and Kathy. We all turned as white as ghosts. I remember Peppy saying, holy shit, he's in the audience. I didn't know what to say. It was probably the worst we ever played, everything was out of key, and you could hear our voices trembling when we sang. When we finished, the waiter came over and said, there's a guy over there at the table who wants to buy you a drink. So we went over to the table and we sat down, and Jack said, you guys weren't home when we got back. What's the matter? I said, well, you hit Peppy with a glass. We were there already 4 or 5 months working with you, you never really sang with us, you said you were going to help us get a record deal. We wrote all these new songs, we wanted to try them out on an audience. I was going on and on. Well, don't worry now, everything has changed, Jack said. I'm going to sing in the band, I got us a deal, we're going to go to Detroit and do our first recording. He had everything nice and rosy again. When are you finishing up here? Jack asked. A couple more weeks, I said. Good, I'll come back up with Kathy and we'll help you bring the stuff back to Long Island. I want you to meet some of these new producers I got. He had it down. So we decided to try it again. We went back to the Long Island home, and as soon as we had loaded everything back in, he looked at us and said, guess what? Now you can't go fucking anywhere. You think you could fuck Jack O'Brien over and escape out of here? His whole disposition had changed. The next day, after Jack and Kathy left, we broke the lock and went into their room. We wanted to know just who we were dealing with. The first thing we saw was this big machine that looked like a counterfeit printing press. Our suspicions were confirmed when we opened up a drawer and saw piles of big denomination bills taped up and stuffed into bags. Then we opened another drawer and there were stacks of checkbooks there, each one with a different name on it: Mr. Jerry Jones, Mr. and Mrs. K. Lawton, on and on. We opened the closet and there were wigs, fake beards, fake mustaches, old people's clothing, and makeup. Then we opened up one more drawer and found his arsenal. He had 6 Winchester rifles, a shitload of 38s, 45s, and 9 millimeters. That night, Jack and Kathy returned. When they saw that we had broken into their room, Jack came back out with a cocked Winchester. "All you motherfuckers are going to sleep together on the fucking living room floor tonight. I tell you what, I've even got something to make sure you don't leave." And then he went into the room and came out with these two big Doberman pinschers. I have a fear of dogs, so I instantly just started shaking and freaking out. Peppy was like, "You've got to relax." "Fuck you, look at these fucking dogs," I said. Imagine how I felt, cowering on the living room floor with a cranked up maniac right out of Justice Files clicking his Winchester as he walked around and his large, vicious Doberman circled their prey. Every so often Kathy would join the scene, and even she was packing a 38 in her blouse. I was now convinced that they were just going to cut us up, bury us in the backyard, and steal our equipment. I figured that they had done this before to other unsuspecting ambitious bands. That night we lay there, and then the next day, somehow or other they went out again and I escaped. I got out through this back door, shimmying through the little doggy flap. I must have walked miles, but I got to a phone booth and called Lydia. "You've got to call an army and the troops. Get Billy, the cook from Maine. He's got a van. You've got to come up and get us, because this guy is going to kill us and you're never going to see me again." And they did. A day went by and we told Jack, "Our friends are coming up to get us." He said, "Oh really?" And we said, "Yeah, they're coming up tomorrow." He said, "That could be a big mistake for everybody." And we thought it was going to be like a mass murder, that he would let them come in and then kill us all and leave. That night the dogs circled us again. They would come up to my face and I could hear them breathing. Nobody slept a wink that night. The next day we were waiting with anticipation when we finally heard a horn blowing outside. A few seconds later, there was a knock on the door, and Jack opened it. We looked out and there was Lydia and Peppy's girlfriend and Billy the chef from Kennebunkport, Maine, who was driving his old 50s Chevy panel truck. Jack put his Winchester out of sight and then walked outside to confront them. When he saw them all lined up, he realized that he couldn't shoot everyone, so our friends came in. We rushed down to the basement and started moving all our gear out of the house into the truck. The whole time Jack was standing outside with his two dogs, looking confused. Just as we got the last piece out into the truck and we were ready to leave, Jack came up to me. "Someday I'm going to fucking kill you," he whispered ominously. "You're never gonna know when, but I'm gonna fucking kill you someday." For many years, when I got up behind the drums, I used to get a feeling that it was gonna be boom. God, I hope this book doesn't stir up an old vendetta. But somehow I don't think Jack made it to senior citizenship. Now that I was back in the city with Lydia, I got the feeling that she was getting serious about our relationship. My relationship with Jerry Nolan had pretty much diminished, thanks to Lydia. She didn't really like him and he didn't really like her. Jerry and I were used to going everywhere together, and now there was my girlfriend tagging along. They used to argue all the time. I think Lydia wanted me all for herself. Life with Lydia wasn't a bed of roses. We fought a lot. Brooklyn chicks were a breed unto themselves, hard and tough, and Lydia was one tough girl. She was short, but she had a raging temper. If I bopped her, she'd pick up whatever was near her and I'd get whacked with it. She took no shit from me. I think back and wonder how I could have done something so disgusting as hitting a woman. I would never do something like that now. But I did then. Getting married would have been like putting gasoline on a fucking fire. So naturally we did it. I proposed to her in May 1969, right after we saw Romeo and Juliet. That movie just got to me. The next thing I knew I was saying, "Do you want to get married?" We used the theme song from the movie as our wedding song. I told Lydia that I wasn't going to get a 9 to 5 job and, because I had no money, I wasn't going to pay for anything, even the wedding. I was going to single-mindedly pursue my musical career until I made it big. So if we were going to wed, she'd have to work a 9 to 5 job. Lydia had no problem with that, she believed in me, and she was prepared to be a good wife. We got married on January 31st, 1970. Being Italian, she wanted a big wedding in a big church, so she got a second job at a clothing store in the village to pay for it. We had the reception in a big hall and I remember I was smoking a joint with Jerry and the guys in a room upstairs. "This is a fucking mistake. What are you doing getting married?" Jerry said to me. He was right. I wasn't ready to get married. But the party was great. Nautilus played, along with the Costello brothers, who used to open for us at the Headliner. My grandmother was there in a wheelchair because she had had a diabetic stroke by then. She wasn't really with the program, but she was there, God bless her. We continued the party back at Lydia's house later, smoking and drinking. In the spring, we finally took our honeymoon. We got a joint passport to save money and then got on a plane for the first time in our lives. We went to Spain first, Madrid and Barcelona. We would sit in the outdoor cafes and drink wine all day and then walk around the city at night. But we saved the best for last. I had been pushing for England. I had ulterior motives. I made up business cards and left them everywhere we went. I thought maybe I'd get lucky and find someone looking for a drummer. In the meantime, I made pilgrimages to the places that the Beatles played. In Piccadilly Circus, we went to see Let It Be, the Beatles' last movie. They were in the process of breaking up then and I just started crying like a baby. "Oh, my God. It's over, it's really over," I was babbling. I recorded the whole movie on a little tape recorder and listened to it over and over again. I hated the food in England, but I loved the clothes. I went to one little store near Carnaby Street and I picked out this beautiful black and gold velvet jacket. The owner was a nice man. I told him I was a musician and I was hoping to make it, and he took some of my cards and then he told us about a club called the Speakeasy, a private after-hours club that was the place to go in the music world. He got us in and we went to see some up-and-coming guy named Elton John. Seeing Elton was an epiphany for me. He played Your Song, and I started crying. He was just so good. Each new song was better than the last one. I had never heard music like that in my life. While I was watching him play, I realized that I could never play Knock on Wood or Foxy Lady again. I had to play songs that had never been heard before. The next morning we were getting set to go home. I put on my new velvet jacket, a pair of blue velvet bell-bottoms that I had just bought, a white t-shirt with red stars, and a white satin scarf. My hair was teased up like Jimmy's, and I slipped on my shades and stood in front of the mirror in the hotel room and I said, "You are going to go home and get into an original band and you're going to make it. You're 24, you're getting too old for this shit. Now is the time." As soon as I got back to Canarsie, I disbanded Nautilus and put an ad in the Village Voice and went on a bunch of auditions, but nothing panned out. Then I got a call from a guy named Mike Brand. He and his writing partner, Peter Shepley, had just gotten out of college and wanted to start a band. Mike was loaded, he lived in the village in a beautiful brownstone with his wife, Beck, who also came from big bucks. Peter was married to a girl named Eleanor, but they didn't have as much money. They had hooked up with this kid named Barry Minsky who wanted to be a rock manager. His dad was the famous nightclub owner who was the basis for the movie The Night They Raided Minsky's. Mike and Peter told me that this Minsky guy knew Lou Morenstein, who did Astral Weeks with Van Morrison, as well as John Cale from the Velvet Underground. I was impressed. I went to meet them in the village, and they played me some of their songs. I loved them. They were like Frank Zappa meets the Rolling Stones meets country and western. I brought a bongo along and I jumped in, and we clicked right from the start. We decided to add a bass player and a guitarist. We found our bass player in Queens, a big fat kid named Michael Benvenga. He loved speed. He could take 4 black beauties and sweat his ass off but keep playing forever. He and I played so well together that we started calling ourselves the Machine. Michael knew a Greek kid named Criss who played lead guitar. He actually sucked and was a rich kid with a shitty attitude, but they brought him into the band, over my objections. I really bonded with Peter and Mike at first. We would meet in the village every day and grab some sandwiches and roll some joints and write all day and night. I'd come home and tell Lydia, "This fucking band is it. This is the band." We named ourselves Chelsea and auditioned for Decca Records. They loved us and gave us a contract. We recorded our album with Lou Morenstein producing. He brought in Larry Fallon, who did all the strings for Astral Weeks, and had John Cale play electric viola. Our music was so different, everybody thought we had a real shot at hitting the jackpot. The album came out in February and we played a gig a few weeks later at a high school. Peter got completely fucked up on booze and passed out because he was so nervous about playing in front of people. Mike, on the other hand, got blasted on weed and couldn't remember the chords. I was furious. "This is a fucking disaster," I screamed. "We can't just make records, we have to go out and play fucking shows. Peter, you gotta be Mick Jagger. You're the lead singer. You can't come out wearing fucking khakis and a short-sleeved shirt and then pass out. You gotta be a rock star." I hadn't realized that those two guys had no experience playing before audiences. After the live disasters, Criss left the band. I was ready to quit, but then Mike and Peter came all the way out to my house in Brooklyn with a guy named Stan Penridge. He was going to replace Criss. At first I didn't like Stan at all. There was something creepy about him that didn't sit right with me. He was a Greek kid, very slick, very smart. They wanted him in the band, and I was outvoted again. The album had come out to great reviews in all the music trades, but it went nowhere. It was just devastating to me that this band didn't make it. But we went back to writing. Stan lived in the village, and I would bring a conga to his house and we'd get high and write all day. Then later Michael, the bass player, would come by after he got off work and the three of us would jam. We got a gig in New Jersey with the new lineup. Peter and Mike were late to the show, so Stan, Michael, and I started without them. And the audience went crazy. When Pete and Mike finally showed up, the place was in an uproar. We knew right then that we wanted to be a power trio. That night, Lips was born. We rehearsed for a couple of months and then played a club in Oceanside in October of 1971 as Lips. Then, naturally, it was back to the headliner with my new band. In January 1972 we played a club called the St. James Infirmary at the Hunter Ski Resort in upstate New York. We weren't getting paid much, but they'd feed us these great hot dogs and we seemed content. But then I'd get flashes of why am I doing this again? I still had that drive to be a star, and I was convinced that I was a better musician than Stan and Michael. Things were getting stagnant with Lydia, too. She was working and I was playing. I was in love, I guess. That's a big word. People love their dogs and their cars, they love skiing. But I had gotten married, so I had to be in love. Lydia was a good cook and she kept a clean house. The problem was money. She was so tight. We didn't have all that much money, but she was giving me only $1 a day to live on. She stuck by me, paid the dues with me, did all the things a wife does, but I was wild. Part of the reason was her jealousy, especially if I got close to other guys. She wanted me all for herself. When you cage someone like that, forget about it when you let him out. Temptation is all around in rock and roll, especially on the road. You would call your girl and tell her how much you miss her and then go back and get laid. The road never changed. Another reason I cheated was that Lydia and I didn't really click in bed. She had no real experience, she had only gone out with 2 other guys before me. And the sex was never enough for me. I always had to have more, and on the road I could have one-nighters every night. I know now that if you really love someone, that's just not acceptable. But at that time I was young and wild and hungry for everything. By April, Michael had left Lips and gone to work at a bank. I started hanging at Stan's East Village pad, and that was a huge mistake. He had been selling pot, but then he started getting into heroin and speedballs. Stan was a very manipulative guy, and he could talk anybody into anything. My dream was shattering once again, and I was ripe for an escape. So when Stan asked me if I wanted to try popping smack, I said, why not? It didn't seem dangerous when Stan was doing it. He didn't pass out on the floor. It was more like, we'll shoot a little dope and then we'll write some more songs. It was exciting, too. Shooting dope is definitely taboo. And it did nullify the pain. After shooting up, I didn't feel any nagging doubts about whether I'd ever make it in music, no feelings that I was getting too old, no sense that my marriage was in a rut. Everything felt perfect for those few hours with him. Everything we wrote sounded genius, everything we did was great, everything we talked about was just right. We were living in a fantasy world. Then I felt guilty and was afraid that I would get hooked on heroin, so I confessed to Lydia that I had been shooting up. She freaked out and I stopped. But I kept going over to Stan's place to write. And he kept dealing smack. One day we were sitting up there working, and somebody buzzed from downstairs. We snuck down the stairs to see who it was and saw 4 tall, skinny black guys waiting by the elevator. They looked like you didn't want to fuck with them. So we ran back upstairs and bolted the door. Stan grabbed a rifle and I picked up his wife's knife. The guys came off the elevator and started pounding on the door and attempted to break in. They were after his drugs. I thought, I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time and I'm going to die over a shoebox of heroin. Finally they gave up and split. I was shaking like a leaf and wondering what this had to do with music. That was the last time I hung out at Stan's place. Around that time I got a call from my old bandmate Joey Lucenti. He had a new band called Infinity, his drummer had broken his leg, and he wanted to know if I'd fill in. They were playing every weekend at the King's Lounge, that mob joint in Williamsburg. I had just left a band that was associated with giants like John Cale and Lou Morenstein. I had a brief taste of what it was like to be a real artist, creating new songs, and then I'd be back in a mob bar playing fucking jukebox music. But Lydia was on my case to work, so I took the gig. I went there my first night and I came in with skin-tight gold, lame pants, a scarf, nail polish, and New York Dolls makeup on. I was a star, at least in my mind. Joey and the other guys were bald and fat by then, in front singing, Louie, Louie, whoa, we gotta go, and I was in the back crashing and booming away at my drums because I was so fucking mad at the world. I was drinking a lot and fucking every single Chick who walked into that room on the weekends, and then I'd go home to Lydia. It was intolerable. But at least it got me away from Stan and got me playing in front of an audience again. I thought that maybe somebody would come into the club and say, "Jesus, look at that guy. He's got talent." So I had Joey print up some business cards for me that read "Have drum will travel, Peter Criss." I had shortened my name when I was in Chelsea to Peter Criss, but somehow Joey added an extra S to my last name and I liked it. So I started from scratch again. I had just turned 26 and I was desperate. I would have worn pantyhose and high heels and a Lone Ranger mask, I wanted to make it so bad. It was my time. I knew I had something special. Every place I ever drummed we'd get a bigger and bigger crowd, and when it would come time for me to play, people would go crazy. I knew I had charisma, that I had something that no one else had. I'd put ads in the Village Voice before, but then I decided to run a classified ad in Rolling Stone. That was where musicians found other musicians. So I took out an ad. 12 simple words. EXPD. Rock and roll drummer looking for a rig. GRP. Doing soft and hard music.